Welcome to Amipal, the #1 place on the internet for the sweetest Amiga content. Now, when the Amiga first came out, it, like many other machines of its time, was limited on the size of hard drives that it could utilise. There's a 32-bit limit that basically means that the maximum size drive you can have is 4 gig. So when larger discs come out, all of a sudden you've got an issue because you can only access 4 gig of it. So it's like, well, what's the point of having all that space? You're also limited by the fact that partitions could only be 2 gig in size as well. So obviously in this day and age we've got bigger discs, bigger drives, SD cards are even larger than that. So really we want to utilise all of that space. Now I've got a FastATA or PowerFlyer IDE interface in my Amiga 1200. That kind of got round the issue by basically splitting these discs into 4 gigabyte chunks. So you'd have like chunks of logical discs on there that the operating system could look at and use, which was, you know, useful in the sense that you could just stick a disc in and all of a sudden you could use it regardless of what version of operating system you used. However, since then, and I think probably just before then as well, you could actually download a patch that would patch the SCSI device to allow large hard disk support. Yeah, large. Also, Workbench 3.9 also introduced larger disk support. So since I'm rebuilding this, basically I want to get over that 4 gig split from the PowerFlyer, remove that. I've got a fresh hard disk in there that I think is 160 gig in size. I'll never fill it with Amiga stuff. But I want to set that up as my my system disk for Workbench. I want to set it up for programs, for games. I then want a what I usually call a browser folder, directory, browser partition, where I want to store files, so images, text, documents, that kind of thing. And probably some kind of download partition too. AmigaOS only needs to be about 100 meg, 150 meg, because I've got all other bits and pieces installed in there as well, so device drivers and what have you. So it doesn't need to be that large. But I'm conscious that a few of the PowerPC games I've got have quite a bit of texture detail in there, MPEG movies, that kind of thing. So I need to create larger partitions for those. So watch as I struggle with that. Now, my first order of business has been to back up all of my AmigaOS partition here onto my SD card. That's all been done, so we're nice and backed up. As you can see, 93 meg in use. That's a nice small OS there. Obviously I've got the drivers on there for the PowerPC, I've got the drivers on there for the Mediator and the Voodoo 3, and various other bits and pieces, so you know, it's not very bloated. So the next step is to try and boot from this SD card, and then hopefully be able to set up the second disk from it. Let's have a look inside. Okay, so here are the 2 hard drives in the power tower. The top one's the Fujitsu on the primary master, and the bottom one is the Hitachi on the secondary, primary slave. And then over here we have the SD card adapter sitting on its own. Right, I've rebooted the machine and got into the early startup sequence. That's holding down both mouse buttons on reboot. Let's have a look at boot options. Now we can see over here we've got select boot device. I want to boot from ADH0, that is the SD card, and I think I need to disable DHO. Let's give that a go and we'll see what happens. Okay, so the reason why this is happening is because something's been run in the startup sequence that is expecting the disk to be called AmigaOS, and my SD card partition here is just called system. So we're going to need to look at the startup sequence and just make a few changes to that to ensure that the correct things are opened in the correct places. Let's do that now. Resetting the machine basically resets what you're going to boot from. So if I was going to boot again from there, I would have had to have gone into the early startup sequence. So by resetting the machine, it's basically booted off the AmigaOS disk anyway. So we're back in my workbench replacement directory opus. What we need to do is go into the startup sequence. So let's have a look in System S. Almost there. Startup sequence. Okay, so anything in here that is calling AmigaOS, I'm going to need to change to System. No, that seems fine. Okay, so let's have a look for the user startup. This may well point to AmigaOS as well. There we go, directory opus. So this we will just change to the generic sys, and then that should load up fine. You can see that MUI, Magic User Interface, is already on sys there. I think we're good elsewhere. I mean, we're going to get a few more assigned failures when this tries to load based on programs, but if we don't open any programs then it won't matter. Right, I'm going to save that and we will reboot again. Amazingly, it worked. The reason why this has got a background is because I messed around with directory opus settings when I assumed that I'd booted up into the SD card earlier, when I hadn't. So this has a background, my usual background, but my actual boot hard drive does not. So how about that? Okay, so that's confirmed now that I've actually booted from the SD card. AmigaOS isn't actually showing on here because I disabled it in the user startup sequence. So this actually proves that I can boot from the secondary device and the SD card, which is pretty amazing. What I am going to try and do now is disable the entirety of that hard drive in the early boot sequence, and we'll see whether or not this will still boot on just that SD card. If that's the case, then I can disconnect the Fujitsu hard drive, and hopefully we can then make a start on setting it up with the PowerFlyer. Okay, well, I did try to remove the discs, basically just disconnecting them from the IDE cable and primary, and basically on reboot, on power up, you can't boot from the secondary port on the PowerFlyer. You need to have the actual driver on the primary channel so that it will load, give the system the ability to actually use the secondary port. So I'm going to have a bit of a disassemble of my tower because the PowerFlyer and associated cables, etc., are all hidden behind that. So I'm going to do that now. Well, I didn't disassemble the mediator and all the associated paraphernalia in the back there, but I did stick the SD card on the cable that's currently on primary, and well, we appear to have a screen, so I'm happy with that. It did complain a bit about various drives not being found, but that's basically because the assigns are all pointing to partitions which are no longer active because I unplugged that disk. So next step, I'll get the secondary, or brand new should I say, hard drive plugged in, and we'll start to get that disk set up. Oh, it's exciting. Right, first things first, I had this disk plugged in, and it was as the slave to my original hard disk, my what would be the current hard disk. So I've just swapped this back to master, so that it will run okay on the primary interface on its own. So let's get that back in there. Right, well, we've got the new hard drive plugged in. We've got the SD card running as the boot disk. So let's go into HD Toolbox. The SD card's currently on a PIO 0 mode, which basically means that it's very slow. It's basically the slowest it can be. That's as a result of the adapter rather than the FastATA. FastATA can go up to PIO 5 if the device supports it. And this is why I'm choosing not to use the SD card as my boot disk, because I'd like it to load a little bit faster, particularly when it's going to libs to grab shared libraries and what have you. Okay, so HD Toolbox, here we are. This is the one that's supplied with AmigaOS 3.9, so nice resizable window, not the standard GAD Tools gadget, so it's a little bit prettier. We'll just cancel that. We can see the SD card at the top here, and you can see how ATA3 prefs, the FastATA splits the disk into 4 GB chunks. Well, sort of 4 GB, 3.9 gig. But I'm going to run FastATA prefs in a second, and then we'll go back into this and see what change has been made. So the SD card's also formatted with FFS, fast filing system, I think, which is also not necessarily the fastest. Oh, how about that? Well, I lied to you. How about that? Previously, when this was on the secondary, it was only going up to PIO 0, so I don't know whether that's a limit on the secondary interface, but never mind. You can see here, disk split, driver, no splits. Also, as an aside, PPC 603E, 16D, 68040, 25 card, defective. That just means that there's a certain instruction missing from my 68040, but it doesn't mean nothing's actually wrong with it. Okay, let's save that. I wonder if HD Toolbox will have updated, or whether we'll need to reboot. Yeah, let's reboot. I've rebooted a number of times, and I just cannot get this to recognise that the disk exists whenever the split is removed. This section of the startup, no split, I can remove that, I can comment that out, and all of a sudden, lo and behold, the hard drive will appear in HD Toolbox, and it will be split as already shown. You can see in the ATA3 driver preferences over here that when no split is on, it doesn't even come up as an option to split or no split. What I was finding was that I was hitting the split no split on the ATA prefs, rebooting, and it was just resetting to what was already there. So I'm not entirely sure what's going on. Another thing to bear in mind, because it's OS 3.9, there is a set patch in here which applies ROM updates to the SCSI device in order to support larger disks. I've done combinations of split, no split, skip ROM updates, commenting out, skip ROM updates, and I just cannot get it to show here unless it is split. So I'm going to have to go away and do some research. So I rebooted, and I've played with prefs and settings and all sorts, and still can't see the drive properly. It's still splitting when it shouldn't be. I'm going to delve back into it now. Let's go into HD Toolbox again. I was just using a custom function of directory opus Magellan there, where you can create custom menus, and I've basically added my preferences and tools and utilities from the system disk to here, so you can just go in there rather than waiting for all the icons to load. Anyway, SCSI.device 50 version 5.0. As you can see, we have it all split. Now, one thing I've read up, let's give this a try. Preferences, ATA3 prefs. So we have the disk is being reported as no split, and the driver is saying split. So let's do that. I was saving it, but let's try using it. I'm going back into HD Toolbox. Okay, so that device again. Aha! So we have it. There's the disk. 149 gig. So I'll level with you. I've already installed that drive and already partitioned it. This was merely done as part of the recording. I'm a hack. What can I say? So I've already created partitions on here. DHO, the smallest I could get it was at 315 meg. It doesn't even need to be that big, I've said previously. And then I've created some other partitions here. This one's particularly big, that will just be for games, but DH1 will be programs, DH2 games, DH3 would be tools. I've got a gig on there. I might even just increase that slightly to 2 gig, because yeah, sure, why not? And then DH4 will be my browser, my content partition. One thing I've done is install something known as PFS, Professional File System, which is a custom file system that's not actually supplied with AmigaOS. Where did I put it? There it is. And this is basically a better file system than the fast file system. It is faster. It's more secure. It's less likely to need continuous validation of the disk if the disk is being written to and your machine reboots for whatever reason. So since I'm setting this disk up from new, I've decided to basically do PFS across all of them. I haven't seen any reports of PFS going bad on people. So you know, let's give this a try. You know, the machine's starting afresh, so let's go for it. So anyway, let's save that and exit. Now, one thing I've already noticed is that we're not getting a list of partitions here, which I should be able to select and format. Don't think we've got any hidden disks or anything. I'm looking through directory opus to see if there's anything in here that will actually show why they're not being shown. Hello. No, but I don't have any bad disks and I wouldn't hide them anyway. Okay. Right, maybe a reboot's required then. Let's try that. So you saw the disk partitioned. Still no disk showing, so let's go back into HD Toolbox. Yep. Oh, and they're split again. Use that. Okay. So the disk is partitioned, but the driver is basically not. No split, no split. Right. Save. You all saw me click save, yeah? Let's reboot again. And a reboot shows the disk's not there either, despite me saving those settings. I'm going to add no split. Oh, come on. Into the startup sequence. And I'm going to save that. And we're going to reboot again and see if that makes a difference. We can but hope. We're adding no split to the startup sequence. Let's take a look at HD Toolbox now. Well, first thing that springs to mind is that SCSI.device is down to 43.35 when it should be 50. So that doesn't inspire confidence. Oh, and my disk has disappeared. Right, back to last known good then, as good as it was. Merely because of the fact that I could actually see the disk in HD Toolbox. Right. So, what's AmigaOS3 Press saying? I mean, how can that be? We've got the disk is showing on secondary in AmigaOS3 Press, but not in HD Toolbox. I'm not going to click save on that because I don't want it to save. Let's reboot again. So after that reboot, I've gone back into AmigaOS3 Press. I've reset it to no split on that disk because that option was available again this time. And SCSI.device is back to 50, so we've still got our partitions on there. Well, this is a bit of a challenge, isn't it? Let's see. I mean, it's not showing on Directory Opus front on the actual workbench replacement. No. Oops. Let's try that again. That's an interesting error, isn't it? Doesn't have the U for unknown command. No, that's not working either. Time to put my thinking cap on. Viewers, the sun is shining, and I've had a revelation and possibly a minor miracle. For we now have focus devices showing, or partition should I say. What have I done differently? Well, what I did was actually change the file system that I was trying to use. I was trying to use, there are two types of PFS, Professional File System, and I was trying to use the PFS Direct SCSI version rather than just standard PFS. I wanted to use PFS rather than Fast Filing System because it's more reliable. It doesn't have to validate the disk if things go naff. And it's faster as well. So I want to put that across the entire disk. So that's what I've done now. And lo and behold, it's actually showing partitions. So I'm dead chuffed with that. I'm going to carry on doing the installation. copying Workbench across to DHO, as it's now called, and we'll go on from there. Yay! One thing I should probably mention here is boot priorities. I've formatted that DH0 partition, and then of course rebooting the machine, we get this screen. This is because the partition has been set as bootable. Yeah, I haven't copied Workbench over to it yet, so we get this. But how do we fix it? Well, I'll show you. Here we are in the early startup menu, early boot menu. Basically, you reboot the machine holding both Amiga keys and control, and when you release that, you hold down both mouse buttons. You keep holding down both mouse buttons until this wonderful grey screen appears. So we'll go into boot options. You can see here we've got a list of boot devices. DF0, that's a floppy drive. CCO, that's the PCM-CIA card. If you ever wanted to boot from there, which no one probably would these days. And then we've got ADHO at the bottom. That is my SD card. And just above it here, DH0, and that's my new hard disk. Any partitions on these devices that are marked as bootable will show in the boot device list. And then you can see here control active devices. You can see we've got other devices below the first four that I've just been through, which are marked as not bootable because they're not flagged as bootable. Other information this shows is priority. Now, the reason why this didn't boot was because the Amiga looked at DH0, which was priority 0, and that comes above priority 3 for the CCO and priority 5 for DF0. And then the SD card's way down at -16. It's probably about as low as you can go in terms of priorities. And so it didn't boot. So what we can do is basically just select ADH0 there, use and then boot, and it will load up. Otherwise it will go through the priority list if nothing is selected in this list. Other information, this is the format of the device, of the partition. ADOS is just fast filing system, or just one of the Amiga file systems. While CFSO, that's a custom filing system. At this point in time, it doesn't know what it is, but that is PFS. And then over here, you can see the different types of devices as well. Track disk is floppy, card disk, PCM-CIA, and then SCSI is one of the SCSI.device devices. And I believe the number afterwards indicates which device it is. So SCSI 0 will be master on primary, SCSI 1 would be slave on primary, and SCSI 2 master on secondary, SCSI 3 slave on secondary. So let's boot, and there we have it. Partitions showing and formatted, above all formatted on Workbench. You can see my AmigaOS 3.9 disk is in. That's the actual CD for the installation. So I'll sort that out another time. But these have all been formatted with PFS3 AIO, and all showing the correct sizes. You can check that by starting a new CLI. Let's actually try and keep this in focus, shall we, so you can see what is happening rather than me going all over the place. And you basically do info. In this case, I think my games partition is particularly massive. And there you go. 75 gig. It's a big partition. But yeah, it's all working. This may have taken a little longer than I intended it to. It really shouldn't have been that difficult, but it was really a case of not knowing how to set up the PowerFlyer after so long not having to do it. Coupled with the fact that OS 3.9 has its own way of handling large disks, so this was a trials and tribulations, let's put it that way. Basically the procedure is plug the hard drive in, start up Workbench. When you get into that, start up ATA3 prefs, ensure it's set to no split, then go into HD Toolbox. That's the important thing, because then you'll see only one disk on there rather than the split of 4 gig logical units. Then you can partition it. Make sure you use PFS3 AIO all in one. That's the most up-to-date version of it. Then when that's all set up, you save the changes to the disk, reboot the machine, and then all those partitions will show up on Workbench and you can format them using the PFS3 tool. Alternatively, you can still use FFS because that supports large disks and partitions now, so that will work. But this was really a case of just getting the PowerFlyer, the FastATA and Workbench 3.9 working together, so it shouldn't really be that difficult. But anyway, thanks for watching. Stay safe where you are, stay indoors if that's the rule in your locale, and tune in next time for more sweet content. Cheers!